Welcome, everyone, to a special report from TravelPulse. I'm Eric Bowman, executive editor for TravelPulse.com. Today's special report is centered around the increasing frequency of in-flight sexual assaults. Joining me today is Mia Taylor, senior writer for TravelPulse, and Dr. Ann Olivarius, chair and senior partner of McAllister Olivarius. Welcome, everyone, for joining. Thank you so much for being here today.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
Yes, so Dr. Ann here has over 30 years experience as a lawyer, financier, philanthropist, writer, and advisor to many public figures. With a background in both civil rights law and corporate law, she specializes in cases of discrimination, sexual harassment, assault, and online abuse. And Mia has been a senior writer here at TravelPulse for a number of years. We're very glad to have both of you on. First, we're going to hear from Mia about this feature, and then we're going to have some questions for Ann, and we'll dive into that. So, Mia, you've done tremendous work here digging into this issue. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about this special report feature article that you've been working on and some of the details and numbers surrounding this issue at hand?
You bet. So over the last year or more, several high-profile cases have made headlines. Southwest, in particular, is the focus of a lawsuit involving a little boy who was molested on a plane. And also Delta was the focus, or is the focus of a lawsuit regarding a woman who says she was sexually assaulted on an airplane during the flight. The FBI also, in April, sent out a press release highlighting the number of cases they've opened in 2023 regarding in-flight sexual assault, and they said that they've opened 96 cases in the past year, which is, quite substantial. And often the men are the perpetrators and women and children are the victims. So there's a lot to dig into here, and Ann's an expert on a lot of this, but in terms of how people can protect themselves, where the airline's responsibilities lie, it's a very meaty issue.
Eric, you're on mute.
Oh, apologies here. Yes. Thank you, Mia, for that. Ann, we're going to kick it to you here. Why do you think incidents of sexual assault here are becoming so commonplace on airplanes right now?
I'm not sure that the number of incidents has changed for over a long period of time. What's being reported is what's changed, that's for sure. Now there are actual tabulations, data is being collected, but this has probably been going on for, since the history of flying and flights. I don't know if there's much difference. Now, that said, porn culture is on the rise and all sorts of other stuff. So it may well be that it's become a thing now to say, hey, I've done this on a flight. Certainly when airlines put beds on flights and first class passengers could sleep on those flights, there was, a club that people could join if they had sexual intercourse on those flights. The whole world keeps changing about these things. And maybe it's, sexy in a particular way for a certain group of people to say that they've had a sexual adventure on a flight, even though the person they had it with was not consenting.
That's huge. That's huge. One of the things that fascinates me most about this topic, and I'm hoping you can address it too a little bit for our viewers, is how can, whether you're a woman or a minor, what can be done to protect yourself from this happening?
Well, there's a theme, the flights that are happening now where this is going on. What we're seeing, the theme is that you have an inebriated, a really drunken passenger who gets on the flight and then continues to drink. And so they get served, liquor as the flight goes on. So he stays in his inebriated state, perhaps gets even more deeply drunk, if that's possible. And then you have children often that have been separate from their parents. Now, there's a complaint about this, but of course, many would say, well, why does the parent let that happen? If the parent is traveling with the child and there are two parents, why don't they keep the child with them? But fair enough, if the children are separated, then, there is something of an obligation on the parents and on the people who are running the flight to keep an eye on them. And I think also when there's a complaint, what's happened in some of these cases is that the airlines don't tend to move the person being assaulted or the passenger assaulting. They leave them there. They may say, this is not good, cut it out, which has happened in a case, but they stay there. So that's not great. Most of the assault seems to happen at night on the red-eye flights, which makes sense. It's a darkened place. And of course, there's a concern that the in-flight attendants aren't up and down the aisles enough, not noticing what's going on.
Yeah. I'm curious because you did touch on this a little bit, can a passenger demand to be moved, or is that not possible if the flight is full or something to that nature?
Well, that's always an issue. If there's no seats available, what happens? There are always the airline seats in the very front where the people who run the plane sit, they bolster in right by the doors. I
Mhm.
guess one could do that. I think it depends on the extent of the abuse. You could ask people to move also,
Sure.
and other people to say there's an issue here. But I think there's a general embarrassment and hesitation for people
Yeah.
to do anything. We had a fabulous paralegal in our firm get on a flight. And
Mhm.
when she was on the flight, when she came in, she's very beautiful. She sat down and she started getting on the messenger system on the flight all sorts of harassment. And it was really quite shocking to her. But she had the presence of mind to instantly get back on that system and complain and shut it down. And then she got off the flight and she went to the press. There was a lot of coverage. But what happened to her? She got abuse from people. A lot of men said, "Why are you so harsh on these guys? If they want to proposition you, if they want to say all sorts of sexual, vulgar things to you, isn't that their right to do that?" And she said, I was a passenger on a flight. Why am I getting all this abuse? I
Yeah.
should be inoculated from this, and it
Yeah.
should have been shut down. It wasn't shut down except by her, but she
Yeah.
was very good about it, and I think she's brought a lot of attention to bear. There's a lot of coverage about this, and people like yourself, Mia, sort of picked it up and said, "Hey, why does this young woman have to deal with this? This should have been something the airline," which goes to the issue of mandatory reporting. We all know that teachers in school, if a kid says, "Oh, something happened to me," that teacher's a mandatory reporter. And most of us think that's a pretty good thing. In
Mhm.
most cases, there are some exceptions. Okay, but on the flight, they leave it to the passengers often to report to the police to do
Right.
something. And what are you going to do if your kid, maybe you don't know how to use Wi-Fi, maybe you don't know how to call the police from the flight? Why is it your responsibility, particularly a minor, to do that? And if you're a parent and it's your kid, you might be fairly upset and be out of your mind a little bit on this and not know quite what to do. I would think that it should be mandatory that the stewardesses, the flight attendants, on every flight, the pilots, somebody has to report these events into the police so they're at the gate when the flight lands.
I think that's a really good point because I reached out to like Southwest and some other airlines for this story and asked them what their specific policies were in the event that these things take place on their planes. And they were not able to reveal that because it's a
Yes.
sensitive security issue. So it's really not clear for passengers, what is
What you
the
do.
airline's
Yeah.
responsibility here.
Yeah. Well, I would think in the bathrooms, if I were running those airlines, in the bathroom stalls, I would have an announcement like they do with trafficking in many places now, but a friendly, easily understandable announcement that says, "Hey, if you are the victim of this or you see this going on around you, not just to you, but if you see something that concerns you, please tell," and then whoever on the flight or what they should do. And I think that would give a lot of comfort to people and also a way to handle a problem before it escalates.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Definitely so. Yeah, we know that unruly passenger behavior has been on the rise since the pandemic. So some sort of messaging, whether that's in the seat back, like you said, in the bathroom there, and something these airlines need to be a bit more proactive. We know that trainings are taking place because of more unruly behavior, but as in terms of this specific topic here in the sexual assaults, I mean, what else do you think? What role and responsibility the airlines themselves have here when these sexual assaults do happen on a plane?
Well, right now, under the Hague Convention, airplanes are liable if there's a sexual assault. Now, but they are restricted in what they have to pay out. So there's a limit of, 165, 70,000. It depends on the currency and what the exchange rate is, but it's somewhere in that region. It's not a lot of money. We had a case against United where a woman in business class was raped. And we found out that stewardesses, flight attendants, they weren't walking back and forth enough. This man went over and she had taken a melatonin. She'd had two bourbons in the lounge before she got on the flight because she was nervous about a long haul flight from New York to London. So she figured she would just try to put herself to sleep. So she deliberately had the two bourbons. She went and then took a melatonin and was asleep. And she woke up and here's this man on top of her and in her.
Wow.
And, finally, she was just beside herself. An in-flight attendant came by and yanked him off. And it was very clear that, it was evident what
Yeah.
was going on when you took a look at his zipper area. And they then called the police at Heathrow, London Heathrow. They were there and, they picked up the guy. And of course, the guy said, well, she encouraged it. I mean, she invited me. The woman was knocked out. It's hard for me to understand how anyone would find, even in a business class seat, they're very narrow. I'm in them all the time. There's no room even to lay down yourself. And I'm a fairly small person. If you're a substantial person, there's no room to do anything. And even for me to roll over, you roll over, Eric, it's tough. There's not a lot of space. And so, of course, he said, well, she invited him and she was beautiful and how could he resist? And, it was just a he said, she said misunderstanding. But, as I said to the lawyer on the other side, how many women do you know? Would your sister, your mother, your girlfriend say to some guy, "Hey, it's on that flight in a business class, seat with all these people around, where I want to actually have sexual relations with you, a total stranger." It's not exactly, I think, the most seductive moment for at least women. Maybe for the guy, it was a real thrill and got that one on the belt, but not for her.
Yeah. You've touched on, one of our final questions is what structural changes need to take place within the industry to rectify this issue or help ease this issue? And you've touched upon a lot of them, which is, attendants making more being more present in the aisles, perhaps a placard in the bathrooms. Are there any other things industry-wide that might help address this
Yeah.
process?
I mean, absolutely mandatory reporting by
Mhm.
that has to happen. Right now, there are different categories. They're numbering now, they're taking out the numbers of these incidences and monitoring them. The FBI is under sexual assault. They just put all the harassment together. So now they're trying to separate it so you get some sense of what's going on. But
Mhm.
clearly, if a person is drunk getting on the plane to start with, that's a question. In a lot of flights in Europe, I've seen people being told, "You're not allowed on the flight, sir. When you're sober up, you can take the next flight." That has produced some very unpleasant responses from those who've had a few drinks. But nonetheless, they're not allowed on the flight. And I've seen that quite a few times in Europe. I've not observed that in the States. But
Yeah.
certainly, if somebody is allowed on a flight, it seems to me if they've been drinking, don't continue. It's like going to a bar. A
Right.
bar is liable in, any place in the world if you continue to give drinks to somebody who's clearly inebriated. If that person goes out, gets in a car and has a car crash, you're going to get hauled in to court, and you should be hauled into court because that you had a duty of care and you didn't do it. So that's really important. General
Yeah.
education, what you're doing, this is great because
Mhm.
you're actually shedding light on something, and you'll have a lot of people sitting there saying, well, yeah, I mean, he touched me, he did that. Well, yeah, I didn't know what to do. All right. So just by having this conversation, people are going to say, all right, I'm going to be able to speak up. I'm going to say something. I'm going
Right.
to know where to go. And if they know that the in-flight attendants are available to talk to, male
Mhm.
or female, whoever you're comfortable with, you'll have more reporting. Keeping
Absolutely.
kids separate next to, people who might have had a few drinks. Maybe it's safer to put kids. I mean, this is more controversial, but if I had a young girl, when I used to send my kids on planes all the time, and they'd always put them with sort of parents or, older women. I noticed this all that I'd say, "Who'd you sit next to?" "Oh, well, she was an old woman."
Yeah.
Probably 40 years old, when they're young kids, but nonetheless,
Yeah.
an old woman. And that, I always felt, well, that's pretty safe. Maybe people should think a bit about that. And why are families being broken up? Can they not try to put the families back together? I
Yeah.
had an incident recently. I was on a British air flight and I had an aisle seat. And in front of me happened to be five women all in aisle seats, and our middle seats were open, just as it happened.
Yeah.
And this man came up to me. He was a very observant Jewish man, and he said his son was not allowed to sit next to me because he couldn't sit next to women.
Oh.
And I said, "I see, but this is my seat, sir. What am I going to do to him?" That was the reverse, which I was put on the block that allegedly I was going to sexually harass or assault this man,
Ah.
must have been 23, who clearly hadn't had a bath in a while. It was a sweaty day anyway. I mean, I couldn't imagine it. And the pilot came back because it was a sort of religious incident. And the pilot came back and said, well, maybe you can sit in one of these other seats. We'll have women move. And the women in front of me, all five of them said, nope, we're sitting right here. He's
Yeah.
going to have to learn to deal with the modern world and behave himself We're
Right.
not going to hurt him. So they're
Right.
dealing with these issues in all sorts of ways of who sits where, what kind of behavior is acceptable, how do you deal with this?
Yeah.
And that's life. I mean, life is complex and you never know who you sit next to on a plane.
Right.
Often very interesting people, but maybe people you wouldn't choose. So
Yeah.
maybe there's more thoughts of that. And
Yeah.
maybe when you book in your flight, if you could do a preference, if I was a parent and said, I'd really like my kid next to, and then insert,
Yeah.
other kids or whatever.
Hmm.
There are easy things that could be done. But I think in the
Yeah.
bathroom, if you put a sign up, that would make a big deal of difference.
I think your comments, and I think to wrap this up, dovetail really nicely with the tips the FBI offer. And one of them they talk about kids who are being put on planes alone, like you mentioned. They suggest that parents request that that child have an aisle seat so that the kid is very visible and never be in that middle seat where they
Yeah.
might between
Yep.
two people and that molestation or assault could happen. So that's a really important thing. The other thing the FBI suggests is that offenders will often test their victims by sort of nudging them when the lights go down and they think that their neighbor is asleep. So they always say if that occurs, establish boundaries. Keep your armrest down. If somebody next to you is sort of doing that, you can alert the flight attendant right away that there might be an issue about to take place. So that's another thing. And I think if the incident happens, the FBI says report it immediately, and the flight attendants can alert law enforcement because there is usually an air marshal on a plane. So those are some.
Yeah, that's true. The other thing that's been talked about is giving a kid away. If you're sitting next to an abuser, it might be really hard for a person, and even an older person, to say, "This is happening.
Yeah,
I'm embarrassed." They may be put in a more threatening situation. The
for
man
sure.
could say, "I'm going to get you afterwards. I'm getting you after the flight." That's
Yeah.
happened before. So if
Mhm.
there's a way that either there's a card or a sign
That's
that
a
it
good
could be
idea.
done,
Yeah.
some sort of sign that signals there's trouble here, so that the in-flight attendant could come and say to the person, would you like to come with me? I've got, you wanted a special meal. Let me give you the
Yeah.
special
Yeah.
meal,
Hmm.
Yeah.
kind of thing on that. Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing is when people are assaulted, what we found, at least on this, when the woman was assaulted, it was very interesting on this United flight at Heathrow at the London airport. There was an announcement when the plane landed. She was in a terrible state. And when the plane landed, they said, would everybody please stay in the seats, please? We've had a couple of serious things, somebody very ill.
Mm.
And, the guards came in, the police, and they went up to the man who had assaulted her and said, come with me right now. And he was surprised, but, off they took him in a way, letting it think maybe there was a sickness or something, but they
Right.
got him off separately. And then they came to her and
Yeah.
they had some wonderful men, and they did have a woman available, police officer come, and she
Mhm.
was in a terrible state. And they took her to a private room and they were with her and calmed her down and said, this is what happens. This is
Yeah.
what you do. So that was important. The other thing that United didn't understand is they called, of course, Scotland Yard to come because it was Heathrow in London. But of
Mhm.
course, it's an American carrier and jurisdiction goes to the Americans when it's an American carrier where an assault happens. So they needed to have called the FBI. They didn't do that.
Yeah.
So that kind of hard for us because they didn't do a rape kit because they were transferring jurisdiction by the time they realized what had happened. So I think having the pilots and the airlines give instruction that if you're on this carrier, all the United pilots should know, yes, you can tell Heathrow, you can tell Scotland Yard, but
So,
the jurisdiction is the FBI. You have to have somebody there from the proper jurisdiction to handle the situation. And likewise, if British Air lands in New York, they have to get somebody from Scotland Yard and the British authorities there to handle the situation. So you don't have it. There is going to be a criminal issue. And when there's a rape, there probably will be a downstream court action. You want to make sure that the evidence doesn't get tainted, that is handled properly in terms of, procedures, police action, that people know what to do. And clearly with United, they didn't know.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
was unfortunate. There should be an education there.
That's a great tip, Anne. I think that's excellent.
yes, very well said. We thank you for joining today. And I think, one thing to note here on the family side of things and with the kids, the DOT does have a new rule proposal out right now that they would get families to sit together on flights without any additional charges that families wouldn't have to pay a fee to be able to sit together. So that could be, a step in the direction there of sort of combating that. And then, like you said, with the messaging, in different parts. So there's certainly more that we need to see from airlines and airports, doing to right the ship here and everything. So thank you so much for joining. Any closing comments, Anne or Mia, that you'd like to make?
I'm really grateful that you're doing this because it does educate people. People they're just not thinking about it. Nobody expects to be assaulted on an airline, and you don't expect your kid to be assaulted. It's a safe place. And when we got this rape case in on United, I remember, we do a lot of sexual assault cases, and you think you've heard all the stories and you're all sadder than sad. And then this came in, and I sat there, remember thinking, I thought I've heard everything. But even on an airline, we're not safe. Even in a business class seat, you're not safe. You can be raped there too. It was just a shock to the system. And our young attorneys, our older attorneys, everybody was like, huh? How does this happen? How can this happen? So thank you for doing this. Thank you. It's important.
I would just say dig into our story to read everything that Anne had to say and the airlines and all the tips we have to offer.
Excellent. Yes, the full story is out on TravelPulse.com. So thank you so much for tuning into this special report here with TravelPulse.
Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you.